He was just a passenger on the flight, until F-35 pilots heard Ugly 6 on the radio. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. This is the tale of a man who was overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected by everyone around him, until the truth behind his identity left everyone in complete silence. But this wasn't just any story. It was the revelation of a hidden legend. Picture this, a group of F-35 fighter pilots, cruising high above the clouds, focused on their training exercises. To them, the airspace was just another day of practice, no different than the hundreds they had done before. But what they didn't know was that one of the passengers on their flight wasn't just any ordinary civilian. The man, in his late 60s, sat quietly, minding his own business, an unremarkable figure in faded clothes. His hair was graying, and his eyes held a depth of experience that was hard to place, yet it didn't seem to attract attention. In fact, no one seemed to notice him at all. But little did the pilots know that this man was about to reveal himself in a way they could never have imagined. The pilots were chatting amongst themselves, some discussing the challenges of the mission ahead, others exchanging jokes, and a few simply staring out the window, lost in thought. The man sat there, barely registering in the background, like an extra in a movie that no one pays attention to. Then, one of the pilots, a young lieutenant who had just recently completed his training, turned to his friend and made a remark about the older man. "I wonder if he even knows what it's like to be up here," he said, laughing. "Probably just some old man with nothing better to do." The comment wasn't malicious, just a throwaway remark, the kind that happens every day. But the old man's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. His eyes flicked briefly over to the young pilot, his gaze sharp for a brief moment, before returning to the window. He didn't say a word. The lieutenant chuckled at the thought of an old man trying to understand fighter jets. It was the kind of casual disrespect that often goes unnoticed in the hustle of military life. But something about this passenger felt different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He simply watched, like a man who had seen and heard it all. The lieutenant made another passing comment, this time louder so the others could hear. "He probably thinks this is all just noise." But again, the old man said nothing. He just sat, his hands resting on the armrests of his seat, his posture relaxed, yet somehow filled with quiet confidence. As the pilots continued their conversation, a new message crackled through their communication system. The frequency they were using was standard military channel, one they rarely used for anything other than operational commands. But then, a strange call came through. It was brief but clear, "Ugly 6." The young lieutenant didn't recognize the call sign, but something about it felt important. There was an air of familiarity, like a memory just out of reach. The communication was followed by a strange silence on the radio. "Ugly 6," the lieutenant muttered, his eyes scanning the cockpit as if waiting for an answer. The other pilots exchanged confused glances. They all knew the call signs of their squadron members, but this one was different. The old man, still sitting quietly in his seat, didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the cockpit, but there was something behind them, something that caught the attention of one of the pilots. A young captain, who had been silently observing the situation, finally spoke up. Could that be who I think it is?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air. The lieutenant turned back to the old man, staring for a long moment. Then, without warning, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Ugly 6." The recognition hit him like a ton of bricks. The old man, this quiet, unassuming figure, wasn't just some passenger. He wasn't just an old man. In that moment, the true nature of the passenger's identity began to unfold, and with it, the realization that they were in the presence of a legend. This man wasn't just anyone. He was a warrior whose name had once echoed through the military world, a man who had lived through some of the most legendary missions in history. And now, this fighter pilot squadron was about to find out the truth of who he really was. But how could they have known? After all, it had been decades since the name Ugly 6 had been heard in any airspace. Yet here he was, sitting quietly, revealing nothing but his presence. As the F-35 soared above, the tone in the cockpit shifted. No one was laughing now. The world outside the windows seemed to pause. The old man was not just a relic of the past. He was still very much a force to be reckoned with. As the F-35s continued their flight, the airspace remained quiet, except for the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. The pilots, still processing the message they had just received, exchanged glances. The name, Ugly Six, lingered in the air, an unspoken weight that none of them could ignore. The lieutenant who had initially dismissed the old man was now fidgeting, his eyes darting from the cockpit to the passengers seated behind him. Something about the call sign had shaken him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He leaned closer to the radio, his hand hovering over the frequency dial, but the silence remained. The old man had not moved, not even a shift in his posture, yet his presence seemed to command the entire space. The captain, still sitting in his seat, felt a strange pull toward the back of the plane, toward the man who seemed so out of place in this high-tech, military environment. The words that the lieutenant had spoken earlier now seemed absurd. Just a passenger, he had said. But now, with the strange call sign still echoing in the cockpit, those words seemed far too simple. The captain turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the old man. There was no obvious sign of recognition, no overt gesture that would indicate any kind of importance. The man simply sat there, his eyes locked forward, almost as if he were lost in thought. The more the captain thought about it, the more unsettling it became. This was no ordinary civilian. The pilots in the cockpit were trained to assess every situation, every individual, in seconds. And yet, this man remained a mystery. His unassuming appearance didn't fit with the unease that had slowly begun to build in the air. The lieutenant, still not fully grasping the significance, turned back to his controls. His hand hovered over the throttle, unsure. The old man's stillness, his quiet dignity, felt like a challenge to everything they knew about power and authority. How could someone so unremarkable carry such an aura? Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't just a call sign. It was a voice. Ugly Six, report in. The captain's heart skipped a beat. He glanced back at the old man, who was still sitting motionless. What the hell is going on? The lieutenant muttered under his breath. The voice on the radio repeated the call sign again, more urgently this time. The old man, who had been silent for the entire flight, slowly leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried a weight that seemed to freeze the entire cockpit. This is Ugly Six. The pilots in the cockpit froze. The words, coming from this quiet figure, hit them like a freight train. They were trained to identify the voices of legends, to know when they were in the presence of greatness. But no one had expected this. No one had expected the man they had written off as just another passenger to turn out to be the legendary Ugly Six. The lieutenant's eyes widened in disbelief, and the captain's face went pale. The radio fell silent once again. The old man sat back in his seat, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. The weight of his words had settled over the cockpit like a heavy fog. The legend of Ugly Six was not just a name. It was a story that had been told in hushed tones, a story of a man who had performed feats that others could only dream of, a man whose skill in combat had been unmatched. And now, sitting right in front of them, was the man who had made those stories real. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. They had just spoken to Ugly Six, the very person they had never imagined they would encounter. The captain's voice broke the silence. "Is this real?" he asked, his tone filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The old man didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence, the calmness in his demeanor, was enough to speak volumes. In that moment, the cockpit fell into a strange reverence. The young lieutenant, still trying to process what had just happened, felt a deep sense of humility flood over him. He had mocked this man, belittled him in front of his fellow pilots, and now, he was facing the very person he had dismissed. The captain cleared his throat, still in shock. "Ugly Six, the Ugly Six." The old man nodded slowly, a faint smile appearing on his lips. The pilots were silent, unsure of what to say next. They had expected this flight to be like any other, filled with banter and routine. But this was different. This was history. The old man had been through wars, through battles that had shaped nations, and now, he was just another passenger on a commercial flight, surrounded by young men who had no idea who he was. But now they knew, and the respect they had for him was immediate, overwhelming. The lieutenant, still processing the shift in reality, finally spoke up. "Sir, we had no idea." The old man's eyes opened again, locking onto the lieutenant with a calm gaze. "You wouldn't have," he replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. The lieutenant swallowed hard, the words failing him. In that brief exchange, everything changed. The pilots who had once seen themselves as the top of the food chain were now the students, and the old man, Ugly Six, was the teacher. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the pilots found themselves in an awkward silence, their minds racing with thoughts they could barely comprehend. The man they had dismissed as just another passenger, an elderly civilian, had just revealed himself to be the legendary Ugly Six. The name that was whispered in awe throughout the military ranks, a name synonymous with feats of unimaginable skill and courage. A name that had been nothing more than a distant story to these pilots, until now. The captain, who had been in charge of the flight, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the lieutenant who had first mocked the old man. The lieutenant was visibly shaken, his eyes wide with disbelief, his earlier bravado completely gone. He could barely meet the captain's gaze. I can't believe it," he muttered under his breath. The captain nodded slowly, still trying to process the gravity of what had just unfolded. "We're flying with a legend," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The weight of the words was heavy. They had known that legends existed, that some people had done things so extraordinary that their names became etched into history. But they never expected to meet one, especially not under such mundane circumstances. The old man, Ugly Six, sat calmly, as if nothing had changed. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded in his lap. He looked like just another elderly man traveling to his destination. But beneath that unassuming exterior was a history that could not be ignored. The lieutenant finally found his voice again, his words hesitant but sincere. "Sir, I had no idea who you were." The old man turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the lieutenant's. There was no anger, no judgment in his gaze, just a quiet understanding. "You wouldn't have," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. The lieutenant swallowed hard, the words he had spoken earlier suddenly feeling like a distant memory. I mocked you," he admitted, his voice faltering. I made jokes. I didn't know." Ugly Six nodded, his expression unchanged. "It's all right," he replied softly. "You don't know the whole story." The pilots were left to reflect on his words, each of them wondering what they had just stumbled into. As the flight continued, the silence in the cockpit grew thicker, more palpable. They were no longer just flying a routine mission. They were flying with someone who had been a part of something much larger than themselves. The young lieutenant sat in his seat, his hands gripping the controls, but his mind was far from the instruments in front of him. He kept glancing back at the old man, who had resumed his quiet observation of the world outside the window. It was as if Ugly Six had seen everything, and nothing could surprise him anymore. The captain, still processing the events, began to speak again. "Sir, what exactly happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ugly Six didn't immediately respond, as though considering how best to answer. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the world in ways most could never imagine. "I did what had to be done," he said simply. "When the mission comes, you don't think about yourself. You just do it. You act." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, the young pilots began to understand the gravity of what they were hearing. They were sitting next to someone who had made impossible decisions, who had carried burdens that none of them could fathom. "But how do you just do it?" the lieutenant asked, his voice filled with awe and curiosity. The old man smiled faintly. "You don't think. You just trust yourself, your training, and the people around you. You trust that you've prepared for moments like these." The captain leaned forward, the words sinking in. "But you're a legend. You've done things that no one else could even dream of. How do you stay, humble?" Ugly Six chuckled softly. "Humility is a part of the job. You learn that quickly. You can't take yourself too seriously. The moment you do, you're finished." The young pilot sat in stunned silence, realizing just how much they had underestimated this man. Ugly Six had been through more than they could imagine, and yet here he was, just sitting quietly, sharing his wisdom without ever once raising his voice. The flight continued on, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no more casual chatter between the pilots. Instead, they focused on the mission ahead, but their minds kept drifting back to the old man in the back of the plane. They had flown countless hours in combat, but nothing had ever prepared them for this moment, meeting a true legend. As the plane approached its destination, the lieutenant found himself thinking about all the people he had mocked, all the times he had judged others based on appearances or first impressions. He felt a deep sense of shame, but also something else, respect. Real respect, not the kind that comes with rank or title, but the kind that is earned through actions, through years of dedication, and through the willingness to give everything for something greater than yourself. The plane began its descent, and the young pilots, forever changed by this encounter, looked out the windows at the world below. They would never forget this flight, nor the man who had taught them more in a few short hours than they had learned in years of training. Ugly Six had shown them what true greatness looked like, and it wasn't in the medals or the accolades. It was in the quiet strength of a man who had seen it all and still chose to remain humble. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The cockpit, once filled with the usual chatter and banter of the pilots, had fallen into a deep silence. No one knew what to say. They had just spent hours flying with a living legend, a man whose name had once been a whispered myth in military circles, a name that had now become undeniable truth. The lieutenant, who had mocked the old man just hours ago, was the first to break the silence. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. The captain, who had been processing the entire encounter, nodded slowly. "I think we've all learned something today," he replied, his tone heavy with respect. As the plane taxied to its designated spot on the airstrip, the pilots, still in a state of disbelief, prepared to disembark. But there was something different now. There was a sense of reverence in the air, a shift in how they saw the world and the people around them. They weren't just pilots anymore. They were witnesses to history. The old man, Ugly Six, remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead. He hadn't moved since the radio call. His calm demeanor, even in the face of such overwhelming recognition, left everyone around him in awe. The lieutenant, his mind still racing with questions, glanced back at him. "Are you really who they say you are?" he asked. The old man turned his head slightly, meeting the lieutenant's eyes. "I was," he replied softly. "I still am, in my own way." The pilots all exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. They had seen heroes before, men and women who had performed extraordinary feats. But this was different. This was a man who had made history, who had been a part of something larger than any of them could comprehend. Yet here he was, still humble, still grounded. As the plane came to a full stop, the captain stood up, his movements deliberate, and turned to the old man. "We owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "For what it's worth, we didn't understand who you were." Ugly Six smiled faintly, his eyes warm. "It's not about apologies," he said quietly. "It's about understanding and respect." The captain nodded, feeling the weight of those words. In that moment, it became clear that the true lesson wasn't just about the history of Ugly Six or his legendary past. It was about the respect that should be given to those who had lived through things most people would never understand. The pilots, now fully aware of the magnitude of the man in front of them, slowly began to gather their things and prepare to leave the plane. But there was one more thing the lieutenant needed to say. He had spent so much time thinking about the old man's past, about the legends surrounding his name, that he hadn't considered the person in front of him. "What's next for you?" the lieutenant asked, genuinely curious. Ugly Six looked out the window for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Next," he repeated softly, "I just keep going. That's all any of us can do." The pilots fell into silence again, absorbing the weight of his words. It wasn't the kind of answer they had expected. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration. It was simply a man who had lived through unimaginable challenges, who had earned his place in history, yet still saw himself as just another person moving forward, one step at a time. As the old man stood up from his seat, the pilots watched him carefully, as if expecting some kind of grand reveal. but there was nothing flashy about his movements. He stood up slowly, adjusted his jacket, and began to move toward the exit with the same calm, steady pace he had maintained throughout the flight. The lieutenant followed him closely, still unsure of what to do with the overwhelming respect he now felt. The door to the plane opened, and they stepped out into the warm air. The ground crew, who had been preparing for the flight's arrival, paused for a moment when they saw the old man. The young pilots, who had spent their careers on the cutting edge of military technology, now found themselves in the presence of someone who had shaped the very things they took for granted. No one said anything. The silence spoke louder than any words could. As Ugly Six walked toward the waiting vehicle, the pilots remained where they were, still processing what had just happened. They had seen combat. They had flown missions that most people would never dream of, but nothing had prepared them for the encounter they had just experienced. The lieutenant turned to the captain. "I don't think I'll ever look at things the same way again," he said quietly. The captain didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the old man, his back now to them, moving with the same quiet dignity that had marked his every action. "Neither will I," he replied finally, his voice thick with a newfound respect. Ugly Six was more than just a legend. He was a reminder that true greatness wasn't about the medals or the accolades. It was about the quiet strength to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, even when the world had moved on. And for the young pilots who had shared this moment, they would never forget the man who had taught them that lesson. As the vehicle carrying Ugly Six drove away, the sound of its engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound silence, one that would echo in the minds of those who had witnessed it for years to come. As the days passed after that extraordinary flight, the pilots found themselves struggling to go back to their usual routines. The mission, the flight, the revelation of Ugly Six, it all felt like a dream, a surreal experience that had left them with more questions than answers. The lieutenant, who had once arrogantly dismissed the old man, could not shake the image of him, calm, composed, and bearing the weight of history with such quiet dignity. He found himself thinking about it constantly, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. He had always seen himself as someone who understood the military, who respected the traditions and the heroes of the past. But he had never truly understood what it meant to be a legend until that day. He had heard the stories, sure. He had heard about the impossible feats and the men who achieved them, but he had never met one, not like this. It was one thing to read about someone in a history book, but it was something entirely different to meet them in person. The captain, too, had not been able to move on from that experience. He had spent his entire career focused on becoming the best pilot, the best leader, always striving to reach the highest ranks. But now, standing in the presence of Ugly Six, he felt small, almost insignificant. The old man had not been a general, not a decorated hero with a slew of medals. He had been a quiet, humble figure, a man whose greatness had come not from accolades or recognition, but from the things he had done when no one was watching. The captain had always believed that greatness was measured by success, by how high you climbed and how much you achieved. But Ugly Six had shown him that greatness could also come from humility, from sacrifice, and from the willingness to do the right thing, even when the world had moved on. Days turned into weeks, and the pilots had returned to their normal duties, but nothing felt the same. Every time they looked at each other, they saw something different, something that had been revealed to them in that brief encounter with the old man. They had been changed. And yet, despite the powerful lesson they had learned, they still felt like they needed to do something more, something to honor the man who had so quietly slipped into their lives and left such a profound impact. One afternoon, as they sat in the break room, the lieutenant turned to the captain. "We need to do something for him," he said, his voice serious. The captain raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We need to honor him," the lieutenant said. "He deserves more than just a passing thank you. He deserves to be remembered." The captain nodded slowly, a sense of understanding settling in. "I agree," he said. "But how do we honor a man like that?" The lieutenant thought for a moment. "We don't have to make it some grand spectacle," he said. "But we can make sure he's recognized, that his name is known." They both sat in silence, thinking. The idea seemed simple enough, yet the task ahead of them felt immense. How do you honor a man who has already given everything? How do you repay someone who has sacrificed so much and asked for nothing in return? The answer came to them one evening, when they were sitting in the same break room, flipping through old military records. They had been looking for something to do, something meaningful, and they had found it. The records were filled with details about past missions, battles, and heroes. But one name, one call sign, stood out among the rest: Ugly Six. They knew they had to find a way to make sure that name would not fade into the past. They reached out to their superiors, pulling strings and making calls. Weeks later, the news came through. Ugly Six was to be officially recognized for his legendary service. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a recognition long overdue. The lieutenant and the captain stood at attention as the ceremony began. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, military veterans, and a few familiar faces from their squadron. The doors opened, and in walked Ugly Six, dressed simply in a uniform that had seen better days. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the room, as if he was unsure why he was there. But when he reached the center of the room, he stopped, and the room fell silent. A 4-star general stood before him, holding a plaque that would be presented to Ugly Six in front of the gathered crowd. The general's voice rang out with authority. For his unparalleled courage, leadership, and unwavering commitment to duty, we honor Ugly Six today. The pilots, along with everyone else in the room, stood in reverence as the plaque was handed over. The old man, Ugly Six, accepted the recognition with the same calm composure that he had displayed throughout the entire journey. There were no tears, no grand speeches. There was only a simple nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the honor. The ceremony ended with a salute, and Ugly Six left the room as quietly as he had entered. But the legacy he had left behind was far from quiet. The lieutenant and the captain stood together, watching the man who had taught them more than any military course could have. He's still just him, the captain said quietly. The lieutenant nodded. And that's why we respect him. As the pilots filed out of the room, they knew they would never forget the lessons Ugly Six had taught them. They had been in the presence of greatness, but not in the way they had expected. It wasn't about medals, titles, or grand gestures. It was about a man who had done what needed to be done, and who had remained humble through it all. And that was something they would carry with them forever. Weeks passed after the ceremony, and life on the base returned to normal. The pilots, still affected by their encounter with Ugly Six, tried to shake off the weight of the lessons they had learned. But no matter how hard they tried, they found themselves thinking about that day more than they ever expected. The lieutenant, especially, felt a change within himself. He had always prided himself on being the best, on knowing everything there was to know about flying, about combat, about strategy. But Ugly Six had shown him that there was much more to being a true hero than just technical skill or accomplishments. It was about humility, about knowing when to step back and let others shine. It was about serving a greater purpose, even when no one was watching. The lieutenant spent his nights thinking about the old man, reflecting on the way Ugly Six had handled everything with such quiet dignity. It wasn't the medals, the titles, or the accolades that defined him. It was the way he carried himself, the way he interacted with others, the way he never boasted about his past or his accomplishments. One evening, after a long day of training, the lieutenant found himself walking past the barracks where Ugly Six was staying. It wasn't that he had any specific reason to go there. He just felt drawn to the place. He wanted to talk to him again, to ask more questions, to learn even more from the man who had changed his perspective on life. He knocked gently on the door, unsure of what to expect. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Ugly Six, looking as calm and collected as always. "You wanted to speak with me?" he asked, his voice steady. The lieutenant nodded, suddenly feeling nervous. "Yes, sir. I just wanted to talk." Ugly Six stepped aside, silently inviting him in. The lieutenant walked into the small, modest room. It was nothing like the luxurious quarters of the senior officers, just a simple, comfortable space. The walls were adorned with old photographs, medals, and some military memorabilia. It was clear that Ugly Six had lived a full life, but there was nothing in this room that screamed legend or hero. Everything was understated, just like the man himself. "Please, have a seat," Ugly Six said, motioning to a chair by the window. The lieutenant sat down, feeling awkward for a moment. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice uncertain. "About humility and respect, about not taking things for granted." Ugly Six nodded, his eyes never leaving the lieutenant. It's easy to get caught up in the rush of things, to focus on what we think is important. But the truth is, the things that matter most are often the ones we can't see right away. The lieutenant sat back, processing the words. How do you do it? He asked. How do you stay so centered, so grounded? Ugly Six smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with a mix of wisdom and experience. It's not about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about learning from those mistakes, from the challenges you face. You learn, you grow, and you keep moving forward. There was a long pause, and then the lieutenant spoke again. Do you ever regret it? He asked. All of it. The wars, the missions, the things you've seen. Ugly Six leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning distant for a moment. Regret? No, not really, he said quietly. But there are things I wish could have been different. Choices I wish I could have made sooner. But at the end of the day, you do what you can, with the tools you have, and you live with the consequences. The lieutenant nodded, understanding the weight of the words. You're right, he said. I've spent too much time thinking about what I could have done better instead of focusing on what I can do now. Ugly Six's eyes softened as he looked at him. That's the right mindset, he said. It's never too late to start again. To be better. To do better. The lieutenant felt a deep sense of gratitude in that moment, for the wisdom that Ugly Six had shared with him. He had come to the old man looking for answers, but what he had found was something far more valuable: perspective. He had learned that true greatness wasn't about living up to expectations or seeking recognition. It was about doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, and being humble enough to accept that sometimes you can't control everything. As the conversation drew to a close, the lieutenant stood up to leave. Thank you, sir, he said sincerely, for everything. Ugly Six stood as well, offering a small, respectful nod. You're welcome, Lieutenant, he said. Now, go out there and make your mark. The world is waiting for you. The lieutenant walked out of the room, a new sense of purpose in his step. He knew that he would never forget this conversation or the lessons that Ugly Six had taught him. He was no longer just a pilot. He was someone who had learned to understand the true meaning of service, of sacrifice, and of humility. And with that, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. It had been several weeks since the ceremony, and life on the base had slowly returned to its routine. The pilots, now back in their usual training, couldn't shake the memory of Ugly Six and the profound lessons they had learned from him. For the lieutenant, those lessons had started to take root in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first day back, he had found himself staring at the control panel of his fighter jet, the familiar buttons and dials now feeling less important than they once had. There was something about Ugly Six's quiet strength that had made him reevaluate everything. The missions, the goals, the constant push for excellence. It wasn't just about being the best anymore. It was about being the kind of person who earned respect without asking for it, who did what was necessary without seeking recognition. His thoughts were interrupted by the familiar voice of the captain. Hey, Lieutenant. You good? The lieutenant looked up, blinking as if coming out of a trance. He nodded slowly, trying to push his thoughts aside. Yeah, just thinking. The captain raised an eyebrow but didn't press. They had all been thinking more lately, in their own ways. Well, we've got a new assignment, the captain continued, tapping a folder against his palm. It's not the usual drill. We're going out of state for a joint mission. The lieutenant felt a flicker of excitement at the prospect. Training was fine, but there was something about real missions, something about getting out there and doing what they had been trained for. What's the mission? He asked, leaning forward. The captain grinned. Top secret as usual, but we'll be working with some of the best in the field. Special forces, a few other branches. It's going to be intense. The lieutenant felt the familiar adrenaline surge at the thought of working with some of the best. Sounds like exactly what we need. The captain nodded. Exactly. And the timing's perfect. A real chance to prove ourselves. As the two of them gathered their things, the lieutenant found his mind wandering again. He couldn't help it. Ugly Six's words had stuck with him. It's not about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about learning from those mistakes. He thought about how many times he had pushed himself to the limit, chasing perfection, only to fall short. What if the key wasn't perfection? What if the key was understanding the bigger picture? Maybe it was about knowing when to push forward and when to step back. Maybe it was about knowing your limits and working within them. A few days later, the squadron was packed and ready to head out. The lieutenant couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation mixed with something else. Something he couldn't quite place. As the jet took off, soaring into the sky, he looked out the window, watching the world below shrink. It was hard not to think about Ugly Six and wonder what he would think about this mission, about the choices they were about to make. Would he be proud of the decisions they made? Would he consider them worthy? The lieutenant wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to take anything for granted anymore. As the squadron approached their destination, a sense of purpose filled the air. This wasn't just any mission. It was a chance to prove that they were more than just pilots. They were leaders, decision-makers, and soldiers who could handle whatever came their way. After landing, the team was briefed on the mission objectives. They were to join forces with several other units for a high-stakes operation. The lieutenant could feel the energy in the room, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on them. He stood at attention with the others, listening intently to the briefing, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't help it. He kept thinking about Ugly Six, about the way the old man had never wavered, how his calm presence had grounded them all. The mission began, and the pilots were thrust into the heart of it. It was grueling, intense, and dangerous. Every decision had to be made with precision, with an awareness that one wrong move could change everything. But as the hours passed, the lieutenant found himself leading with a new sense of confidence. It wasn't just the skills he had honed over the years. It was something deeper. It was the understanding that leadership wasn't about showing off or proving yourself to others. It was about knowing your team, knowing your strengths, and using them to succeed together. In the heat of the operation, there were moments when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. But instead of panicking, the lieutenant found himself staying calm, focused, just like Ugly Six had taught him. The mission was a success, and as they returned to base, the lieutenant felt a sense of accomplishment. But it wasn't just about completing the mission. It was about how they had done it, how they had worked together, trusted each other, and learned from their mistakes. The captain approached him as they debriefed. "You did good out there," the captain said with a grin. The lieutenant smiled, but his thoughts immediately went to Ugly Six. "We all did good," he replied. The captain raised an eyebrow. "You've changed, Lieutenant." The lieutenant laughed softly. "I guess I have." That night, as he lay in bed, the lieutenant thought again about Ugly Six. He had never gotten a chance to ask him more about his past, to understand everything the old man had been through. But he didn't need to. He had learned all he needed to know from the way Ugly Six had lived, from the quiet wisdom that had come through in every word he spoke. The next morning, the lieutenant stood by the window, looking out at the rising sun. He had always been driven by the need to be the best, but now he knew that the key to greatness wasn't about perfection. It was about humility, about knowing when to learn and when to lead. And most importantly, it was about serving a cause greater than yourself, just like Ugly Six had done his entire life. The days following the mission were filled with reflection for the lieutenant. Though the mission had been a success, the victory felt muted, overshadowed by the lessons that had lingered with him since his encounter with Ugly Six. Each day, he found himself caught between the demands of his role and the internal changes he had undergone. What had seemed like routine, cut-and-dried military life before, now felt more complicated. His perspective on leadership, on success, and on duty had shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate. No longer did he measure his worth by how many kills he could rack up or how many records he could break. No longer did he only look to the future, racing toward the next goal. He now understood the value in stopping to assess the present, to learn from those who had come before him, and to apply those lessons to better himself and his team. He had even started to speak differently, act differently. His fellow pilots had noticed. The usual banter in the break room had been replaced by more meaningful conversations that touched on strategy, on duty, on leadership. As he sat at the table with the captain, the two of them discussed the mission they had completed, but the lieutenant's mind kept drifting back to Ugly Six. It wasn't the heroism of the old man that stuck with him most. It was the humility, the quiet confidence, the way Ugly Six had never tried to impress anyone. He simply was who he was, and that was enough. The captain, who had been his closest ally on the mission, leaned in slightly. "You've changed, Lieutenant. I've never seen you like this before." The lieutenant looked up, a small smile playing at his lips. "I guess I have," he said. He didn't need to go into detail. The captain already knew. He had seen the change in the lieutenant's demeanor, heard it in his voice, and noticed the shift in his approach to everything. The old drive for perfection was still there, but now it was tempered by something else, a recognition that greatness didn't come from perfection. It came from service, from humility, and from making the right choices, even when no one was looking. Later that afternoon, as the lieutenant walked across the base, he found himself thinking about the future. Ugly Six words kept echoing in his mind. You do what you can with the tools you have, and you live with the consequences. He had spent so much of his life striving for the next mission, the next accolade. But now, he saw that there was more to being a soldier than just checking off boxes. There was a deeper responsibility, one that came with experience, wisdom, and understanding. It wasn't just about taking orders. It was about knowing when to lead, when to follow, and when to simply be there for others. As the lieutenant reflected on his personal journey, he couldn't help but feel a new sense of responsibility. He knew that his path ahead wasn't just about military success. It was about becoming the kind of leader who inspired others to be better, to do better. But more importantly, it was about continuing to learn, to grow, and to share the wisdom of those who had gone before him, just as Ugly Six had shared his wisdom with him. A few days later, during a squadron briefing, the lieutenant spoke up. "We're good pilots," he said, his voice steady, but with a new weight behind it. "But we need to be better than just good. We need to be leaders." The room went quiet as the other pilots turned to look at him. He could feel their eyes on him, but he wasn't nervous. This wasn't about him. It was about them. It's not just about the missions, or the kills, or the records. It's about what we stand for. It's about the kind of people we want to be when we're out there. We've all learned a lot, but now it's time to put that knowledge to use. The captain, who had been listening intently, gave him a small nod. He had seen the transformation firsthand. The other pilots, some of them still processing the lieutenant's words, shifted in their seats. They weren't used to this side of him, the reflective, thoughtful side. The lieutenant stood tall, looking around at his squadron. "We owe it to ourselves, to each other, to lead with integrity, with respect. We need to remember that we're more than just soldiers, we're people. And how we treat each other, how we lead, matters." The room remained silent for a moment, and then one of the younger pilots spoke up. "You're right, Lieutenant. I never really thought about it like that." The lieutenant smiled slightly, feeling a sense of pride in his chest. He had said what needed to be said, and it had landed. It wasn't just about orders. It was about making sure that everyone understood the bigger picture. That, as a team, they could achieve more than any individual could alone. As the meeting continued, the lieutenant felt something shift within him. He wasn't just preparing for the next mission. He was preparing for the future, one where leadership and humility went hand in hand. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer chasing perfection. He was chasing something far greater, a life of purpose, of service, and of integrity. And with that, he was ready for whatever came next. The mission was set to be one of the most challenging the squadron had faced in months. The lieutenant had a strong feeling that it would push him and the others to their limits. But it wasn't just the mission that weighed on his mind. It was the lessons he had learned from Ugly Six, and the sense of responsibility that now seemed to follow him everywhere. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come since the day they met the old man. It was as though the path ahead of him had shifted subtly, but unmistakably. He now saw the world not as a series of checkboxes to tick off, but as an ongoing journey of growth, learning, and making a difference. His thoughts were interrupted when the squadron was called into a debriefing room. The air was thick with anticipation. The lieutenant stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his posture straight. But there was something different in his demeanor. He felt ready for whatever came next, not because he was confident in his abilities as a pilot, but because he knew that true leadership wasn't just about being the best in the cockpit. It was about being there for the team, supporting them, and learning from the best. The general stepped in, immediately commanding attention. "Gentlemen, this is a high-stakes mission. We'll be working with Allied forces, coordinating a complex operation across multiple locations. It's not going to be easy, but I trust that you're all prepared." The room went quiet as the pilots processed the information. They knew that when the general spoke like that, it meant they were facing something serious. The lieutenant's heart rate increased. Slightly, but he steadied his breathing. This wasn't about fear. It was about focus. We'll be dealing with some of the best units in the field, the general continued. This mission will require precision, timing, and coordination, and we'll be depending on each other to make it work. The lieutenant could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on him. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been preparing for. He had always considered himself a top-tier pilot, but now, he had a new understanding of what it meant to be part of a team. The mission briefing continued with detailed plans and strategies, but the lieutenant's mind kept drifting back to ugly 6 words. It's about learning from your mistakes, staying grounded, and serving the greater purpose. The team broke from the meeting and prepared for the mission. As the pilots suited up and prepped their aircraft, the lieutenant caught a glimpse of the captain. The two exchanged a brief nod, both aware of the gravity of what they were about to do. The lieutenant had learned a lot from the captain over the course of their missions, but it was the lessons from Ugly 6 that he found himself leaning on the most. As the jets roared to life and the squadron ascended into the sky, the lieutenant's mind sharpened. The world below shrank as the adrenaline of the mission took over. They were on their way to execute one of the most critical operations in recent memory, and failure wasn't an option. He felt the familiar rush of responsibility surge through him, but this time, it was tempered by a quiet confidence. As they flew deeper into enemy territory, everything seemed to slow down. The squadron communicated in tight, concise bursts. The lieutenant's focus was on the mission, but there was a subtle shift in his approach. He wasn't just listening to the radio chatter and responding automatically. He was actively assessing, considering the best course of action for his team. They faced multiple obstacles throughout the mission, from tight airspace to unexpected tactical shifts. But with each new challenge, the lieutenant found himself more at ease. He was no longer just reacting. He was thinking ahead, anticipating what the team would need next. It wasn't perfect, but it was efficient, and most importantly, it was collaborative. The mission went off without a hitch. They completed their objectives, and the squadron returned to base. The debriefing went smoothly, but the lieutenant knew that the true success of the mission lay in the way they had all come together. It wasn't about who had the best shot or who had the most kills. It was about how they had worked as a team, how they had supported each other in the heat of the moment. After the debriefing, the lieutenant found himself standing outside, watching the sun set over the base. He had a new sense of purpose. The weight of leadership no longer felt like a burden. It felt like an honor. He thought about Ugly 6 again, about the quiet strength that had radiated from the old man. Ugly 6 had never sought recognition, had never asked for accolades. He had simply done his duty, quietly and without fanfare, and in doing so, he had set an example for others to follow. The lieutenant knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more missions, more challenges ahead, but he was ready. Ready not just to be the best in the cockpit, but to be the best leader he could be. He had learned from the best, both in the air and on the ground, and now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the lieutenant smiled to himself. He knew that no matter what came next, he would face it with the same quiet confidence and humility that Ugly 6 had shown him. Because greatness wasn't about being perfect. It was about being ready, being humble, and being there for the people who needed you most. The squadron had just returned from their latest mission, and the usual debriefing followed, but this time, something felt different. The lieutenant sat in the room, processing everything that had happened, but his thoughts kept returning to the same place. It wasn't the mission's success or the tactical brilliance they had displayed. It wasn't the praise from their superiors or the adrenaline of flying through enemy territory. No, it was something much more personal. It was the realization that everything he had been working towards had changed. The goals he had set for himself, the way he defined success, had all been shifted by the quiet lessons of a man who had walked through more battles than anyone could count. Ugly 6 had shown him that true leadership wasn't about power or accolades. It wasn't about being the fastest or the best at pulling the trigger. It was about being grounded, about understanding when to push forward and when to step back. It was about knowing that your team's success was more important than your own. As the lieutenant walked out of the debriefing room, he noticed the captain standing by the door, waiting for him. The two of them exchanged a look, and the captain gave him a small smile. "You've been quiet today," the captain said. "What's on your mind?" The lieutenant paused, considering the question. He had been quiet for days now, trying to process everything he had learned. He had been a good pilot, but now he wanted to be more. He wanted to be a leader, someone who could inspire those around him, someone who could be counted on when things got tough. Just thinking about everything, the lieutenant replied, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. About what it really means to lead. The captain raised an eyebrow. You've always been a good leader, Lieutenant. What's changed? The lieutenant smiled, but it wasn't the usual smile. It was a smile that came from somewhere deeper, from a place of understanding that had only recently opened up to him. I think I'm finally starting to get it, he said. It's not about being the best. It's about being there for the team, about lifting them up when they need it. It's about humility, and it's about service. The captain nodded slowly, understanding exactly what the lieutenant meant. You're right, he said. It's not about individual glory. It's about the collective effort. It's about doing your part and helping everyone around you do theirs. The lieutenant felt a surge of respect for the captain, for all the leaders who had come before him, and for Ugly Six, who had set the standard. I've learned a lot, the lieutenant said, looking at his hands as if they held the answers. But there's still so much more to learn. The captain clapped him on the shoulder. That's the right attitude. You're never done learning, but you're on the right path. The lieutenant nodded, his heart swelling with pride. It was a simple conversation, but it meant more to him than anything he had experienced in the cockpit. It meant that he was starting to understand what true leadership looked like, and that meant he was ready for whatever came next. As the day wore on, the lieutenant found himself reflecting on all that he had learned. The mission had been a success, but the true victory was something different. It was the shift in his mindset, the realization that leadership wasn't about standing at the front and barking orders. It was about being part of something bigger, something more important than himself. He remembered Ugly Six's words. It's not about perfection. It's about learning from your mistakes. The lieutenant had made mistakes, and he knew he would make more. But now, he understood that it was okay. What mattered was that he learned from those mistakes and helped others do the same. As he walked across the base later that afternoon, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced before. It was a quiet confidence, not rooted in arrogance, but in understanding. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't about winning battles or proving his worth. It was about serving the people around him and being the kind of leader who inspired others to do their best. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the base as the lieutenant walked towards his quarters. He thought about the future, about the missions, the challenges, and the unknowns that lay ahead. But for the first time, he wasn't anxious. He was ready. He had learned what it truly meant to lead, to serve, and to be part of something much bigger than himself. And that made all the difference. The mission had been successful, but as the lieutenant walked back to his quarters that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had changed within him. The adrenaline from the operation still buzzed in his veins, but it was tempered by a quiet realization. He wasn't the same person he had been before. The mission was done, the orders carried out, and the team was safe. But there was more to leadership than just completing the task. The truth was, the mission had been easy in comparison to the lessons he had learned from Ugly Six. The old man's wisdom had seeped into his bones, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the lessons remained. As he stood by his window, staring out at the night sky, the lieutenant thought about all the men and women who had come before him, the legends whose stories were passed down through whispers and awe. He realized now that it wasn't their feats that made them legends. It was how they had carried themselves, how they had impacted others, how they had led with purpose. It wasn't about how many battles they won or how many medals they earned. It was about the people they helped along the way, the example they set, and the humility they carried. Ugly Six had lived through unimaginable pain, loss, and sacrifice. He had earned his place in history, not by being the loudest, but by doing the right thing in the most difficult of circumstances. The lieutenant had spent so many years trying to prove himself, to be the best, but he now understood that greatness wasn't about individual achievement. It was about lifting others up and making them better in the process. It was about serving, about leading in a way that made those around you want to be better. As the days passed, the lieutenant found himself taking more time to listen, to watch, to learn. He became more patient, more thoughtful in his decisions. He was still a pilot, still a soldier, but now he saw himself as part of a larger team, a team that wasn't just about skill and precision, but about trust, respect, and shared responsibility. The squadron noticed the change in him. The young pilots who had once looked to him for answers now saw him as a leader, someone they could turn to for guidance. The captain, who had always been a steady presence, found himself leaning on the lieutenant more, appreciating his newfound wisdom. One evening, after a particularly grueling training exercise, the captain approached the lieutenant. "You've changed, Lieutenant," he said, his voice soft but serious. The lieutenant looked at him, unsure of what to say. He knew he had changed, but hearing it from someone else made it feel real. "For the better, I hope," the lieutenant replied. The captain nodded. "Definitely. You've become the kind of leader that others look up to." The lieutenant smiled, but it wasn't the cocky, confident smile he had worn before. This one was different. It was humble, knowing. "I've learned a lot," he said quietly. "From you, from the team, and most importantly, from Ugly Six." The captain raised an eyebrow at the mention of Ugly Six's name. "I thought you'd learned from the old man," he said, a hint of humor in his voice. "I think I'm just starting to understand it all," the lieutenant said. "It's not about the mission. It's about the people. It's about who we are when the mission is over. It's about making sure we've all got each other's backs." The captain looked at him for a long moment, considering his words. "You've got it," he said finally. "I knew you would. It was just a matter of time." The lieutenant nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't the perfect leader, the perfect pilot. But he was getting closer. And that was enough. The following weeks brought more challenges, more missions, but the lieutenant faced them with a calm confidence he hadn't known before. His team responded to him in ways they hadn't before. They trusted him more, followed his lead with less hesitation. They saw the change in him, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. And with each successful mission, each moment of teamwork and collaboration, the lieutenant knew he was growing closer to the kind of leader he wanted to be. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It wasn't about being the best pilot or the fastest shot. It was about being someone others could rely on, someone who led with humility and purpose. One day, as the squadron gathered for another briefing, the lieutenant found himself standing at the front, looking out over the team. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel the need to prove anything. Instead, he felt proud. Proud of what they had accomplished, proud of the trust they had built, and proud of the man he was becoming. "We've got another mission," he said, his voice steady. "But we're ready. We're always ready. Because we're a team. And that's how we'll succeed." The room was silent for a moment before the captain gave him a small nod of approval. The pilots around him looked at each other, a new sense of respect in their eyes. The lieutenant smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. They were ready for whatever came next. Together, the mission had ended successfully, but for the lieutenant, it felt like a turning point. As he walked back to the squadron's quarters, he felt something settle inside him. This was different. This time, there was a sense of true accomplishment, not because they had completed another high-stakes operation, but because of the way they had done it. The unity, the trust, the leadership, they had all come together in a way that had never been more tangible. The lieutenant was no longer just the guy in the cockpit. He was now someone who could inspire his team, who could lead with integrity and humility. And that was something he never expected to feel so deeply. As he entered his quarters, he was greeted by the familiar hum of the base, the usual clamor of boots on the ground, and planes taking off in the distance. It was a routine he had known for years, but now it felt different. Everything felt more meaningful. He had finally understood the essence of leadership, not in the way people often talked about it, not in terms of power or rank, but in service and responsibility. He thought about Ugly Six again, about the lessons that had shaped him into a leader. Ugly Six had never looked for the spotlight. He had never sought validation. The old man's actions had spoken volumes. His humility, his quiet confidence, his dedication to the mission and to his team. The lieutenant had realized that those qualities were what truly made a leader, and he knew he had to embody them from now on. That evening, as he sat at his desk, his mind drifted to the upcoming challenges. There would be more missions, more opportunities to prove himself. But now, he understood that it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving it to himself, about knowing he was doing the right thing in the right way. The next morning, the squadron was called in for a briefing about their next mission. It was a different kind of operation, one that would take them far out of their comfort zone, into unfamiliar territory, with a new set of variables and unknowns. The lieutenant stood with the rest of the team as the briefing commenced. But as he listened to the objectives, he found himself not just absorbing the information, but also thinking about how they could approach the task as a unit. How could they support each other? How could they trust one another to make the right call in the heat of the moment? His mind was no longer focused solely on his individual performance. It was about the collective success of the team. The captain, noticing the change in the lieutenant's demeanor, gave him a nod of approval as they prepared to depart. "You're ready for this," the captain said, his voice filled with respect. The lieutenant nodded, feeling a sense of confidence settle within him. He wasn't just a pilot. He was part of a larger mission, part of something greater than himself. The mission took them to new heights, both figuratively and literally. As they flew toward the objective, the lieutenant's focus remained sharp. But this time, instead of feeling the usual pressure to lead by sheer force, he felt a calm strength, the kind that comes from trusting his team and trusting the process. Each step of the mission required careful coordination, but it wasn't just the technical aspects that made it successful. It was the way the team worked together. The lieutenant had learned to step back when necessary, to trust his fellow pilots to make decisions, and to support them when they needed it. When the mission was complete and they returned to base, the lieutenant couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not because they had succeeded, but because they had done it as a team. He had truly learned what it meant to lead, to serve, and to inspire. The squadron's morale was high, and their respect for one another was evident in their actions and words. The captain, who had been watching the lieutenant closely throughout the mission, approached him as they disembarked. "You've really come into your own," the captain said. "You led with confidence and humility. The team followed your example." The lieutenant smiled, but his thoughts immediately went back to Ugly 6. "It's all thanks to what I learned from him," he said quietly. "I finally understand what leadership really means." The captain chuckled. "It's not an easy thing to grasp, but you've got it. And that's what makes you the kind of leader we need." As the squadron settled in for the night, the lieutenant felt a sense of peace. He had no illusions of being perfect. There would still be challenges ahead, but now, he understood that it wasn't about facing them alone. It was about facing them together, with humility, trust, and a commitment to the greater good. And with that realization, he felt ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, the lieutenant felt the weight of the lessons he had learned from the past several months. The mission they had just completed had been one of the most challenging yet, and although the results were successful, he knew that the real victory wasn't in the mission itself. It was in the changes that had taken place within him. He had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated, and the quiet wisdom of Ugly 6 had transformed the way he viewed leadership, teamwork, and his own role as a pilot. The squadron continued to move forward, completing mission after mission, but there was a sense of camaraderie now that hadn't been there before. Each member of the team understood their place, knew when to lead and when to follow, and, most importantly, they trusted each other. This was no longer just a group of individuals trying to make it through another mission. This was a team, and the lieutenant had learned that teamwork was the foundation of success. The lieutenant was walking across the base one afternoon, reflecting on the journey he had been on, when he saw the captain standing by the hangar, watching the planes take off. He approached him, a sense of gratitude swelling within him. "You've come a long way," the captain said, noticing the lieutenant's approach. "We've all come a long way," the lieutenant replied, his voice steady. "It's not just me. It's the team. We've learned to trust each other in ways we never did before." The captain nodded, a proud smile on his face. "That's what I've been waiting to see. And you've led the way in that. Not by commanding, but by showing everyone what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself." The lieutenant felt a quiet pride fill him. "It wasn't always easy," he said, looking out at the planes. "I've made mistakes, and I still will. But now I know it's okay, as long as I learn from them, and make sure the team does too." "That's what true leadership is," the captain said. "It's about recognizing that you don't have all the answers, but you're always willing to learn, adapt, and do what's best for those around you." The lieutenant's mind wandered back to Ugly 6, to the lessons he had shared. "I'm still learning," he said, "and I think that's the point. You never stop learning, as long as you're willing to listen." The captain slapped him on the back, his smile widening. "Well, keep listening, Lieutenant. You're on the right path. I can see it in the way you lead." As the conversation ended, The lieutenant walked back to his quarters, his heart feeling lighter than it had in months. He was no longer just a soldier, rushing toward the next mission. He was a leader, a part of something far greater than himself. The work ahead of him would be hard, the challenges would continue to arise, but now he knew how to face them. Not alone, but with his team by his side, each person playing their part, working together toward the greater good. That night, as he lay in bed, the lieutenant thought about the future. He thought about Ugly Six, about the man who had lived through so much and still managed to be humble, still managed to lead by example, with grace and humility. He had been right all along. It wasn't about perfection. It was about integrity, about making the right choices when it counted most, and about never losing sight of the bigger picture. The lieutenant wasn't sure where this journey would take him next. He didn't know what challenges would lie ahead. But one thing was certain. He was ready. He was ready to lead, to learn, and to serve with the same quiet strength that had been passed down to him. He knew that no matter what came next, he would face it with confidence, humility, and the unwavering support of the team that stood by his side. As he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but smile. He had found his purpose, and it was more than he could have ever imagined.